Hello, welcome again to Expounding the Bible. I'm your host, Nathanael Morel. In today's video, we want to look at a particular event that Ellen White sort of predicted or prophesied. And if we did a video on Ellen White, I believe the name was Ellen White Ellen White and her writings inspired of God, and you can go look at that in the past videos. It's there. You're welcome to see it. It gives a more full detail of Ellen White. We saw that her role in ministry, a role of a prophet. We saw that she saw prophetic events. We saw other things that a prophet should do, and she qualifies in that office. And we saw the number one thing that a prophet has to do is the prophecy of that prophet come to pass. And we saw three prophecies or predictions that Ellen White has said, and they all came to pass. One was World War I. She predicted World War I. That came to pass. Two, she predicted the destruction in San Francisco, that the great earthquake of San Francisco back in 1906. She predicted that. So you may want to go back and look at that video and see Ellen White. But here we want to deal with another prediction here that's written in one of the books of Ellen White. This is Testimonies to the Church, Volume 9. A very good set of books, Testimonies to the Church, Volume 1 through 9. And in this particular book, she lays down a prophecy. We want to talk about, did Ellen White predict 9/11? So we want to look at, and if you know 9/11, back in September 11th, 2001, the Twin Towers fell, supposedly terror attacks according to the news media. We also, the Pentagon was hit. We also had Flight 93 crash into the ground, disappeared. No one knows what happened according to the media. So about 3,000 people were killed in that day, and I believe just in the Twin Towers alone. So a very hard tragedy for the American people in America that particular day. And we want to see whether God gave us a lift, a heads up that this event was going to happen. So we want to look at Testimonies to the Church, Volume 9. And interesting enough, we are going to start reading in page 11. And this is what Ellen White starts saying. It's called Section 1, for the coming king, for the coming of the king, the last crisis. And this is what she starts out saying. This is Testimonies, Volume 9, page 11. And it says, "We are living in the time of the end. The last of the fulfilling signs of the times declare that the coming of Christ is near at hand. The days in which we live are solemn and important. The Spirit of God is gradually but surely being withdrawn from the earth. Plagues and judgments are already falling upon the despisers of the grace of God. The calamities upon land and sea, the unsettled state of society, the alarms of war are portentous. They forecast approaching events of the greatest magnitude." So she says that the time of the end is fast approaching and things are going to happen. And here she says alarms of war, society is going to be very bad, unsettled state of society. And she said that these events are just approaching a great magnitude. These are foreseeing events of the coming of Christ. Now watch what she says in verse 12. Not verse 12, page 12. She says, "On one occasion, when in New York City, I was in the night season called upon to behold buildings rising story after story towards heaven." Now, mind you, she wrote this back around 1909. This book was published. So this is about 80, 90 years before 9/11 took place. Now, she's in New York City. She says that God gave her a vision while she was staying in New York City. And in her day, New York City was a big city. Not as big as today, but it was a big city. But it didn't have much tall buildings. I believe the tallest building was probably like 5 or 10 stories tall. So back in her day, that was considered tall. Today, that's nothing. But she says that in the future, there's going to be tall buildings. We call them today skyscrapers. Now she says these buildings were warranted or maybe guaranteed to be fireproof. And they were erected to glorify their owners and builders. Higher and still higher these buildings rose, and in them the most costly material was used. So she says these buildings were basically warranted to be fireproof. And the most costly material was used in the construction of these buildings. Now you look at the Twin Towers. You look at the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center. Those were high skyscraper buildings. I believe 110, 112, somewhere around there, stories tall. That's huge. 1,000 feet tall. Now, when you look at when the World Trade Center was constructed, first of all, the most costly material was used. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds, of tons, hundreds of thousands of tons of steel. And I'm not just talking about a little, I'm talking about steel, thick steel. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of tons of cubic yards of concrete. The whole building was basically steel reinforced concrete. It was almost virtually impossible for that building to fall down, especially by a fire. You look at the designers and the constructors of the World Trade Center, of the Twin Towers. You know what they say? They say that the building was so strong that it was so powerful enough to withstand an airplane hitting it, to withstand fires, to withstand high winds, to withstand a hurricane, to withstand an earthquake. They built that thing so strong that almost nothing could have brought that building down. The most costly material was used big time. It was warranted to be fireproof. Now, this is what she says happened next. This is page 13 now. She says, the scene that next passed before me was an alarm of fire. Men looked at these lofty and supposedly fireproof buildings and said, they are perfectly safe. You see, people, they look at the Twin Towers, they said, nothing's going to bring down that building. Like that building is just steel and concrete. That's fireproof. She says, but these buildings were consumed as if made of pitch. The fire engines or the firemen could do nothing to stay the destruction. She says, next thing you know, the once buildings that were fireproof and that people admired, next thing you know, they were consumed with fire as if they were pitch. The firemen couldn't do nothing. And when you look at 9/11, that's exactly what happened. You look at these buildings, the Twin Towers, steel, reinforced concrete, they just go, they just went down free fall speed in about 10, 11 seconds. They all came down. Boom, the two buildings. So, just as Ellen White says, they were consumed as if they were pitch. Thousands of tons of steel, thousands of tons of concrete turned to dust and powder in an instant. There ain't nothing that was going to stop it. Now, I'm not going to go into the cause of why the towers fell, but the point is, she says that these buildings that were fireproof, they fell as pitch. And that the firemen couldn't do anything. And when you look at 9/11, the firemen couldn't do anything. They couldn't put the fire out. The best thing they could have done was go inside the building and help people come out. And by doing so, many lost their lives trying to save people. So when you look at 9/11 and this particular prophecy that Ellen White, this vision that Ellen White was shown in New York City, it may fit the role. Now, I'm not going to say whether this is a direct application of 9/11. It could be 9/11, or it could be some greater catastrophe in the future. Maybe not just to New York City, but to other cities round about. But according to the picture that she wrote here, it matches almost identical to 9/11. So for me, I will be convinced, yes, Ellen White saw 9/11, and I believe that that was God trying to tell his people that there is going to be things going on in the world that will be pointing to his coming. Calamities in the world. You see, if society will only obey God and his commandments, we will not see the destruction that we're seeing today. Today, the earth is filled with violence, is full of war. Society is unstable. Why? Because we have neglected the laws of God. So God here is now saying, because you have neglected me, I'm going to neglect you. And we see hundreds of times in the Bible that God says to his people, if you neglect me, I will visit back on you in wrath. Why? Because you have forsaken God and you have turned to other things. And God will pour judgments upon not just here in the United States, but upon the world if we fail to go back to God. So God is letting us know by 9/11, that big catastrophe, God is saying, listen, this is just a little thing of what's to come if you don't go back to worship me and worship God, follow his commandments, the 10 commandments that we find in Exodus chapter 20. So God gave, I believe God gave Ellen White this vision of prophecy of this destruction in New York City to warn God's people, go back to God. And does God people listen? Most of the time, no. God's people doesn't listen. Next thing you know, 9/11 happens. And we see that this was prophesied about 90, 80 years before 9/11 took place. That is all fulfilling of prophecy. So that is what I wanted to bring to our attention today, that 9/11 was prophesied. It was prophesied by God to his people as a sign of one of the things that God will do if we fail to hearken to him. So that is what I wanted to bring to our attention. You can go study it more. This is Testimonies to the Church, Volume 9 by Ellen White. Study page 11 through 13. Actually, maybe study the whole chapter if you want to. It will be good. Hopefully we can find God in a catastrophe and find God and go back to God, and hopefully and prayerfully to avoid more catastrophe to our society if we go back to obeying God's commandments. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, please press like. Don't forget to subscribe. We're also on Facebook at Expounding the Bible. Until then, this is your host, Nathanael Morel, saying, have a blessed day.